Welcome everyone to tonight's webinar. Thank you for joining us today for the Black Historical Consciousness, Principles, Power, and Oppression. We're so excited to be here today. We are joined today by our co-presenters from Houston ISD. We're so excited to have LaShadra McBride. She is a social studies curriculum specialist. And we're joined here by Samantha Manchak. She is a teacher development specialist in also Houston Independent School District, where she writes social studies curriculum. Well, I'm going to turn it over to our fabulous co-presenters today.
All right. Thank you so much, Melissa. First of all, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our session titled Planning Through the Lens of the Black Historical Consciousness Principles, Theme, Power, and Oppression. So let's go ahead and look at our agenda for tonight. So, of course, we've already done our introductions. That will be followed by objectives and outcomes. We'll have an introduction to the Black Historical Consciousness Principles. If you don't know what that is, you will very soon. We'll have content-based activity and exploration, followed by reflection, Q&A session, and then finally, we will ask at the end of the webinar that you complete a very quick little survey. All right, so let's go ahead and look at our objectives. So by the end of this evening's webinar, you will have, first and foremost, defined the Black consciousness principles, specifically the theme of power and oppression, which is our focus this evening. Explored historical examples of power and oppression and its application in ethnic studies class, and also reflected on your practice as a teacher who incorporates ethnic studies pedagogy through the lens of the Black historical consciousness principle or theme of power and oppression. All right, so let's go ahead and start off with a quick discussion. On the screen right now, everyone, is a series of inquiries. What we're asking you to do is just go ahead and carefully read those inquiries. And as you're reading, please keep the following questions in mind. So the first question is, what are these questions asking students to think about? And then secondly, what historical concepts and structures, such as social, political, or economic structure, are they asking students to consider? And, in analyzing, these inquiries, we can see that the questions, and, you guys have alluded to this, ask students to consider the role or influence of racism and other oppressive structure and constructs on the history of the United States. So in today's webinar, we'll actually explore the Black historical consciousness principles, or principle, I should say, of power and oppression, which can be applied in developing curriculum based on these and as well as similar topics. All right, so cultivating what we're going to refer to as a critical consciousness is very important in the development and delivering of ethnic studies-based course material and lessons. So when we think about critical consciousness, this is a term that can be defined as the ability to recognize and analyze systems of inequality and the commitment to take action against these systems. And according to Freire, developing such consciousness is what truly allows people to act, or in this instance, when we think about African American studies, teach for the humanization of society. So in teaching African American studies in particular, specifically, content centered around the concept of power and oppression, Dr. LaGarrett King of the Carter Center for K through 12 Black History Education at the University of Missouri argues that one must take a Black historical consciousness approach, as power, oppression, and racism are important concepts in understanding how systems as well as institutions have victimized Black people throughout history. So the question that still remains, everyone, is how does one develop or, cultivate a critical consciousness or a Black historical consciousness of power and oppression? So one thing that we believe is that this is best done through the utilization of the Black historical consciousness principles in African American studies classrooms. So Dr. LaGarrett King's research-based article, which someone has referred to early on in the webinar, titled Black History is Not American History, actually focuses on the teaching of Black history from a Black historical consciousness approach. And it also identifies 6 principles or themes educators should consider when building an African American studies-based curriculum. So these principles include Black agency, resistance, and perseverance. So here in the classroom, you'll be looking at the ongoing but strong fight appetite for social change led by Black people, as an example. You have the second, which is Africa and the African diaspora. So here you would be thinking about the Black experience before 1619, which we know, unfortunately, often, a student's introduction to Black history. So an example here would be to explore successful African kingdoms and Black experiences around the world. The next is Black joy and love. We want to add that. And here, you're looking at Black cultural expression and rich legacies. So the Black arts movement would be a prime example here, followed by Black identities, where you would explore the multiple identities of Black people instead of, just presenting Black people, or presenting the narrative, I should say, that paints Black people as just one-dimensional. And then finally, you have Black historical contention. And here you would explore the complexities of Black history. So just as an example, maybe exploring the quite contentious issue of reparations. I did say that there were 6 themes. We just briefly reviewed 5 of those, but our focus today, however, is what is listed as actually the first principle in Dr. King's article within the framework, which is power and oppression. So to lead us in discussions and activities around this particular theme, I'll go ahead and turn it over to my colleague, Sam Sawyer.
All right, thank you, LaShardra. So I'm going to introduce Dr. King's framing of power and oppression in his Black historical consciousness principles. He says that power and oppression, Black histories, are narratives that highlight the lack of justice, freedom, equality, equity that Black people have experienced throughout history. So central to these narratives is how Black people have been victims to racism, white supremacy, anti-Black social structures, as well as individual actions. And so before we move on, we actually want to go back to those questions that we saw at the very beginning of our session this evening. You guys examined those. You threw in some suggestions in the chat. Now we want to make connections between these questions and our theme that we're exploring tonight, which is power and oppression. So take a couple of minutes to read back over these questions now that we have the definition for you here on the slide. How do these questions encourage students to think critically about this theme of power and oppression? So these questions are examples of ways that you can ask students to think about power and oppression in topics throughout U.S. history. Notice that they're not simply asking students to recall information. They're encouraging students to examine power dynamics in history and the impact of that power imbalance on the lives of Black people throughout history. And so we have several historical examples of power and oppression, or of time periods where you could examine power and oppression throughout U.S. history. These include slavery in North and South America, the development and sustainability of racialized and chattel slavery, the emergence of Jim Crow, the nadir of race relations, and the impact of policies such as Reaganomics or the war on drugs and mass incarceration. And so again, we'll pause for a couple of minutes so you can think of other places throughout U.S. history, or even beyond, if we're applying this in kind of a broader kind of pan-African experience, where we could include those points in history on this list. Okay, see the 1920s and appropriation of Black music by the dominant culture. Yeah, and I'm sure there are other instances, points in kind of shorter rather than broader points in U.S. history that we can think of, such as the impact of redlining and other policies in the 20th century that are going to create an imbalance of power dynamics. And seeing hidden truths needs to be exposed and explained of U.S. history. Absolutely. Okay, so we're now going to dive a little deeper into some of the resources that Active Classroom has available that were created utilizing the Black historical consciousness principles as a foundation for the lesson framing. So we want you to evaluate these resources and see how they might serve as examples of lessons that can help students examine power and oppression throughout Black history. So Shardra is going to drop a link to a Jamboard as well as a Google file that contains 3 lessons from Active Classroom's new African American Studies series. We would like for you to access the Jamboard and explore these lessons, and then as you explore the lessons, use these questions to kind of drive what you're looking for throughout. And if you've never used Jamboard before, you have to just click and you can add a comment or text anywhere on the slide. On each slide in the Jamboard is a different one of these questions. So as you're going through and examining the different lesson templates, the different resources, if you'll go back and kind of add through your thinking on those different slides. So we're going to take about 10 minutes to look through. I think there are 3 different lesson examples. So I just wanted to show the feature of Jamboard in case folks might be unfamiliar with it and how to scroll through the different slides. You can use the link or the arrows at the top, and it will take you through different slides where you can add a sticky note and type your text and then add it to each of the different slides. So you're welcome to move between so that you can see the different questions and add your question on, or add your thoughts on the question. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at some of your responses. And also, if anyone would like raise hand feature or the chat to share out your thinking, we do encourage that as well. So I see we've looked at the Great Migration activity and the conflict leasing lesson. And the Great Migration seems to guide students to think about power dynamics in several ways, especially the activity to explain push and pull factors and considering why Black people would be pushed out of the South. Okay, and conflict leasing connects directly to power dynamics because all someone has to be accused of was a small crime or infraction of a local ordinance. So you're dealing with laws and governance and examining power structures in that realm. Okay, how does it help build students' understanding of power? And again, we have the Great Migration and convict leasing lessons. Some of the documents discuss both redlining in urban areas and the Tulsa Race Massacre. This would encourage students to build their understanding of power, even in a vibrant and successful community. And convict leasing, because you can see the power of accusation and powerlessness of being convicted of a crime or an infraction. Okay, and I even see some kind of conversation happening here too. Convict leasing, not really diverse perspectives with this one. The lesson's more general and looks at how this happened to many different people of color across a variety of locations. Okay, and several primary sources are used from the Black perspective and could be taken from a deficit position if the lesson didn't include stories of resistance. I think that's an important addition to include there. All right. And then finally, the bulk of the lesson is a document study when it comes to analyzing primary sources. And of course, primary sources are an important way to add multiple perspectives as well, which could include both examples in the convict leasing lesson of those primary sources that show examples of that, as well as those sources of resistance, as was mentioned by the second commenter here. Okay, so now is the point in which we are going to reflect on our own lesson planning and how you can incorporate different facets of the Black historical consciousness principles into your curriculum. So we are going to drop an additional link in the chat. This time it's going to go to a Google Doc that will guide you through this reflective process. In order to access it and to edit it, you'll need to click make a copy so that you can have that available to you and can type in it, and it'll focus on these questions. If you were to lesson plan, what would your topic be that you would like to focus on, or what topic do you have that you already teach that you feel you would like to teach through the lens of Dr. King's Black historical consciousness principles? And as you're thinking about this, what questions would you need to ask yourself to help students build their understanding of power dynamics in your lesson? What questions would you need to ask students? We saw some examples earlier, but how would you need to shape your questions that you would use in your lesson? 3, will your lesson be taught from a Black perspective? How can you ensure that it is taught from a Black perspective? And how will you ensure that multiple Black perspectives are included? And we've given examples of social class, region, ethnicity, gender, but we also saw different power dynamics that was suggested on the Jamboard. We're not just focusing on the oppression, for example, but also perspectives of resistance within that oppression so that there is a multifaceted experience that's shown. What primary and secondary sources could you use to teach that topic? And finally, what questions do you need to consider when vetting resources that you'll use to teach this lesson? How can you ensure that the resources that you're using are going to be taught from a perspective or through the lens of the Black historical consciousness principles? Okay, so we'll come back together and maybe share out some of our things. Your question was about the lessons and open-ended questions. Did you want to unmute and kind of explain your thinking with the question? And
Sure. I just noticed that in reviewing briefly the 3 lessons, most of it was like open and closed kind of responses with the DOK 1 or 2. And that I wondered in the additional resources when it suggested there was an IDM lesson, if there were more focused questions that students might be able to pull in multiple perspectives of power and oppression and resistance in some of those different instances that could be difficult to address. Thank you.
yeah, I think that's a great question. I think when I look at the lessons, I usually focus on the guiding questions questions or kind of the objective focus as being more of the one that can address the multiple perspectives versus the ones that are addressing, say, just one of the secondary readings or one of the primary source readings, because then even if that perspective isn't included in the resources that are given, that might be something, as was mentioned in the Jamboard, I might seek out that perspective of resistance to show, or another way, or to complicate that question even further. But thank you for your question there. So we'll also take some time for any questions that you may have. Both LaCharge and I are happy to kind of field those and answer any questions you might have, or if anybody else has any suggestions if somebody poses a question, we want to leave this space for any sort of discourse.
I just put in the chat, but I wanted to briefly just share that I think I have a really hard time as a white educator who's trying to work towards a more Black historical consciousness in the lessons I provide for my pre-service teachers and also my students, to tackle one lens of Black historical consciousness without the others. So I was just going to ask if you have access, if you wouldn't mind sharing the link to the article too, so that other folks could also get a look at those, if that's helpful. And thank you.
And actually, as we were talking through, the Jamboard pieces, it becomes really apparent very quickly that, or how interrelated all of these are. Like, you have to have multiple perspectives within it and multiple strains of the Black historical consciousness principles throughout lessons, just to have that diversity of perspective incorporated.
We did have one other question in there. As a new U.S. history teacher, are there suggestions for primary source collections that would offer multiple Black perspectives? And that sort of goes along with this wrote, which is additional resources to help teachers expose the truth that would be helpful.
One resource that I relied on when I taught U.S. history was the Zen Education Project. I think they have a couple of different activities that are posed from multiple perspectives. I'm thinking their Brown versus Board of Education activity does a really good job of providing multiple perspectives on Little Rock, and not just multiple, like white versus Black segregationists versus like integrationists. There's multiple Black perspectives within that too that really speak to, if you read the article that we just dropped in the chat, what Dr. King speaks to in regards to Brown versus Board of Education, kind of the diversity of perspectives there and complicating the narrative that we have around that. So that's Zen Education Project, zened.org. And I'm trying to think, Shardra, feel free to jump in. My brain's kind of racked with perspectives. I also always get the primary source anthologies, and you can find different ones over different topics. Again, they'll provide multiple perspectives from Black history as opposed to like a broader U.S. history source book. Shardra, did you have anything you want to add?
No, I definitely agree with you. We pull a lot from Zen, and of course, as well as other resources such as, the Library of Congress and PBS. Think about Boston University has an African American Studies Center that has quite a bit of quite a nice set of resources as well. So those are a few others.
And also, I'll add that Active Classroom is working on expanding its African American Studies curriculum. And so I know we looked at 3 different lessons. I think there were 7 or 8 in there, and I know that there's more on the way. So they will continue to expand. Many of them are based in primary sources, and so they are kind of providing those primary source resources for you. And then if you feel like an additional perspective is missing, then utilizing the Library of Congress. And I will say one resource I do like, and now it's coming back to me, Chronicling America, which is from the Library of Congress. It's their newspaper archives. I have done quite a bit of research in that archive and found lots of newspapers from Black publishers. And again, that's great to kind of compare different perspectives regionally via Black newspapers or comparing it to mainstream. It's Chronicling America, chronicling like the Houston Chronicle, but Chronicling America, and it's through the Library of Congress. I see it in the chat now. That's it. Yeah. And also, I'm glad you reminded me of that, because one of the historians that they've used for that, her name's Jean Theo Harris. Her book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, is over, and she also has The Rebellious Life of Rosa Parks. The Rebellious Life has a children's version, so like a young reader's version, but the other one I've used with my high school students to kind of the introduction to kind of teach multiple perspectives of civil rights movement. Again, it's called A More Beautiful and Terrible History by Jean Theo Harris. It's not a primary source per se, a secondary source, and it would be great as background knowledge for teachers as well. I'm going to go ahead and move to the last slide because I know we're kind of cutting it close. Want to contact us directly. Our information is up here, both of our email addresses. We are also both on Twitter, and we are sharing out our ethnic studies journey in HISD as we continue to expand access to ethnic studies courses. We're building out our African American studies course and our Mexican American American Studies course over this school year and rolling out that curriculum with teachers and professional development. So if you want to follow along with us, our information is up there. And then again, if you have any questions for us, feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much. I, for one, really enjoyed it. And we here at Social Studies School Service appreciate you letting us to be part of your ongoing professional development. And thank you so much again for being here tonight. Thank you, LaShardra and Samantha, for sharing all of your vast expertise with you. There was not one question that stumped you. That was awesome today. Have a great evening, everyone.